If we have a son, name him Francis.
I'll agree to that. This is our episode on Francis Ford Coppola and his new film Megalopolis. My name is Alex from Los Angeles.
And I'm Karan from Los Angeles as well. Or should I say from Megalopolis?
That's right. We're all living in the future.
Welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We're two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but were both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In each episode, we'll cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of movies. Join us as we explore why they matter to us before reviewing 3 movies in their filmography that made the biggest impact on us. So yeah, it's the big one.
It
I
is.
suppose.
This is the movie I've been anticipating the most actually this entire year. So I'm happy to finally talk about it. And then also to dive into Francis Ford Coppola, who is obviously one of the great directors that has had a very fascinating career over the last 40 to 50 years that I think is really going to be fun to talk about.
Yeah, I'm
So
excited about it too. A little nervous too, because I think it's overwhelming to dive into someone like that. I just I've had that feeling the entire time thinking about this episode in a good way. But
mhm.
it's just feel like some of these movies are so iconic that it almost feels trite to cover them in, our silly little thing here.
No, I know. So some of the movies we're going to be talking about today, even Megalopolis in a way, are going to be covered by everyone till the end of time. Like these movies will
Yeah.
not stop being talked about until the human species is gone. So yeah, it is a little bit intimidating. But I think for me, in terms of Coppola in general, I was aware of him for sure as a kid, but he always was at least positioned in my mind as a filmmaker that makes adult movies. And I don't mean like pornography. I mean sort of adult dramas, things that as a kid just I wouldn't like or be interested in. So I was always aware of like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, but those were never things where as a child I was like, even as a teenager, oh, I gotta watch this. So it wasn't really until kind of later, as a late teen, sort of right as I was going off to college, that I start actually seeing these films. And I'm definitely glad that I waited, because even though they are masterworks. And maybe if I was 12 or 13, if I watched them, I might have appreciated it. It definitely is more of a, you have to be more of an adult, I think, to just sit back with the pace of it and all the themes and things that are dealing with. They're very, very complex. And it wasn't actually until last year that I decided to go and watch all the Coppola movies, because I'd
Mhm.
seen the big ones, Dracula and the Conversation, etc. But if he's made so many films, like 20 plus films, and he definitely has had a lot of valleys in a career with some peaks too. So I wanted to go. I just said it was a New Year's resolution to myself last year to go and watch them all. And I really did, after going through all of his movies, have a much more of appreciation for him just as an innovator, as an entrepreneur, as a risk taker. And after that watch of all of his films, I really felt that in a way you could say he is the most sort of American filmmaker in that sense. I mean, one of the stereotypes of America is risk taking and doing things different and wanting to zig when everyone else is zagging. Like that is something I think that Americans are known for, in terms of not resting on the past or looking at how things are done. It's like, no, we want to do things differently, and we think that we are the ones, as an individual, who can do that. And I think throughout Coppola's entire career, that has been his ethos. Like he's not in it to do big franchises. He's not in it for the money, really. He's just really in it to push the boundaries of art, not only himself, but he wants to change the industry. I mean, he has in certain ways and hasn't in others. Even the founding of his production company, American Zoetrope, was supposed to be essentially a artist commune in the 60s. And then he tried it again in the 80s. But, he actually bought studio space, and he's trying to reinvent how productions are made. And that does not go well for him, makes him bankrupt. But it's fascinating to me just seeing the films in his career that are these big swings. Like he's the guy who just takes all these big swings, and I think he just enjoys the thrill of that. That was sort of my impression on him, is after watching all those movies. I appreciate him much more for his life story and what he was trying to do than necessarily all of his films. Some of them are just total disasters, and some of them are the best movies that have ever been made. And I think that's what you
Mhm.
get when you gamble. Sometimes you win big and you hit that jackpot, and other times you strike out. But you keep trying, and I think that's what has been the most admirable thing to me about Coppola. I mean, hell, we're here talking about Megalopolis in a little bit, a movie that he started writing after Apocalypse Now 40 years ago, and now it's finally on the screens. I don't know. I have a lot of respect for the guy. What about you? What was your kind of impression of Coppola from India? Was it also some of these films floating around the ether like Godfather and Apocalypse Now?
Yeah, kind of similar. I feel like I'd always heard of those names of those movies, but like you said, these were grown-up movies
Hmm.
that I wasn't interested in, wasn't really shown, and it was sort of a faraway thing. And of course, I came to them much later in life, but by the time I came to them, I think the lore around them was already cemented, right? That
Mm.
these are the must-have in the canon on every list, what have you. So you come to that, and I think and we'll get into that obviously as we talk about those movies. The funny thing is that despite all the expectation, those movies they still beat them, and
Hmm.
that's the crazy thing about these movies. Like, I mean, talk about peaks to your point. Like nobody has that actually, because we've all come to these movies 20 years 30 years later after they made and they've already been in the canon, and yet they deliver and are timeless and they keep growing. And how many people have that, a lot of people have made amazing movies, but they're not embedded in the culture, and they're not
Hmm.
timeless. A handful of movies have that space, and some of these movies that he made has those, which is amazing and incredible. But then to kind of build on what you're saying, I haven't seen all of his movies, especially the disasters. I
Don't.
probably
Some of the
will one
some of the
day.
maybe one day, but like
Maybe
only as an
not.
intellectual exercise. Some of them are just so
Yeah.
so terrible.
I mean, I can sort of feel it, and that's the thing. I mean, of course, I'll have a better sense if I did watch them, but to build on what you were saying, there's innovation, ingenuity, and all of that, but there's also ego,
Hmm.
which sort of comes with somebody who is like that, who's an artist. And it almost feels like when things are going badly or when there are constraints, that's when he actually shines. And the production histories and stories of the movies that are in the canon have a life of their own, because they were such troubled productions. And it's sort of interesting to me that those are the ones that actually are good or great versus the other ones where he had the money and the free will to do whatever are not. I mean, I haven't seen most of them, but that's sort of what feels like it, right?
Hmm.
So it's interesting that there is a little bit of not a little bit, but like a lot of ego in the way as well. And
Absolutely.
that leads to interesting outcomes, and Megalopolis almost is like a cherry on the cake of that cake of
Hmm.
innovation and ego and spelling everything on the nose, but also having art with it and behind it. So it's just a fascinating career. And we can't talk about him and not talk about Sophia and this whole family, right? Like they're sort of in the movie royalty palace, if you will,
Hmm.
of American movies. And it's so fascinating to me to see what she's done, who's couldn't be a more different filmmaker,
Right.
but also very American in my mind. But like a new kind of America, but also very European, also, you could argue. So it's just very interesting to compare and contrast the two and what Eleanor, his wife, did and her documentary. So it's just a fascinating family. I don't think we have American movies the way we see it, the way we understand them without him and this family. Their thumbprints are all over.
Absolutely. And that was actually an interesting, his sort of the family piece of it, because
Yeah.
obviously not only the people you mentioned, but Jason Schwartzman and
Right.
Nicolas Cage, there's a lot of other people that are in this Coppola extended family tree. And for a while, especially as a kid, when I was first kind of getting into this, I kind of resented that a little bit. It's like, oh, this is nepotism gone wild. And of course, you're making your dad is doing the score of Godfather and your sister's in the movie. And it's just sort of like it
Right.
rubbed me the wrong way. And it wasn't until actually I did this complete rewatch, or not rewatch, watch of his films last year and listened to some interviews with him. To me now, I think it's actually kind of sweet and cool that it's like a family business in the true sense, like
Yeah.
a corner store where, the owners hire their kids. It's like, yeah, you could get mad about, oh, this is nepotism, and you would never have gotten that job as a teenager working at the corner store if it wasn't for your dad owning the place. Well, yeah, but there's something cool about just a family business, and the power of family and the importance of that. And I think those are a lot of themes that come through in his films. And I think it's kind of cool that he's supporting his entire family and encouraging them to get into this space. It's like a family of artists and
Yeah.
performers in a way. I think that it's like a family band.
I
Sometimes you're gonna
totally
have,
agree.
and I just now I really admire that about him, and I don't kind of criticize his extended family in the way that that I used to. Like, oh, Sophia, like, okay, fine, like your dad's helping you out. It's like, yeah, he is. Like, that's actually kind of cool and nice and great to have one of the greatest filmmakers as a father encourage you to go off and be your own artist. And now she definitely is. I mean, would she have gotten that start without her dad? No, but like that doesn't diminish at all the work that she's put out there into the world. And I'm glad, just as a enjoyer of film, that she's there. And that is
I
because of
totally
him and
agree.
that extended family. So now I feel this is, and even looking at the credits of the Megalopolis too, I actually noticed the visual effects supervisor was a guy that I worked with as a PA back in my first job. And he was related to Coppola in some way. And we always sort of talked about it, and he would say, oh, yeah, like he was in Jack. The movie Jack is like an extra. And I was
Hmm.
like, oh, that's kind of cool. And now he's like the visual effects supervisor in Megalopolis. I was like, oh, cool. Like I haven't talked to him in 15 years, but I'm glad to see that he's still in the family orbit of Coppola. And that's cool. It's like cool that it's
I
this
think it's
family
cool,
troop.
and especially, I mean, I don't know about all the other folks, but at least the actors and directors that we know of, they've
Hmm.
all found their own voices. That's the thing that makes a big difference in my mind, right?
Right.
That sure, you can open the door for somebody in your family and they follow the family business, but then what are they actually bringing? What are they actually contributing? And each of these people couldn't be more different in terms of their voices individually, but also with respect to Coppola
Hmm.
himself, right? Like
Hmm.
it's fascinating to see how the tree has kind of branched off and done totally different things, which I think is very cool and is a testament to them, but also him to
Yeah.
bring them on, but then foster this almost like the what he was trying to do with the commune. I think his family is probably a bigger example or a better example of that. Like each of them
Right.
got a stage, but also got a chance to kind of find their own voice and own self.
Exactly. Yeah, he gave the world Nicolas Cage. Like you, if anything, that is his enduring legacy beyond The Godfather. But no, you're totally
Yeah.
right. This wasn't people just riding on his coattails forever. They
Yeah.
branched off, and I think it's an admirable thing that I used to look down upon, and it's nice that I'm again reading the credits of Megalopolis. Like this is cool. It feels like a family production in a way, and that's cool. I really admire that about him. So speaking of Megalopolis, I think it's time that we jump into this. So this just came out. The IMDb plot summary. The city of New Rome is the main conflict between Caesar Catalina, a brilliant artist in favor of a utopian future, and the greedy mayor Cicero. Between them is Julia Cicero, her loyalty divided between her father and her beloved. Written and directed by Francis Ford Coppola, starring Adam Driver, Giancarlo Esposito, Natalie Emmanuel, Shia LaBeouf, Lawrence Fishburne, Talia Shire, Aubrey Plaza, and John Voight. So, like I said, this is movies. I've been anticipating this for years. I actually never thought I'd ever see this movie at all. Like it's been
Yeah.
talked about for so many decades, and it fits in starts of it getting funded. So this was number one for me this year, and I thought it was incredibly interesting. I'll put it that way. I'll start with that. It was a very interesting piece that I do think I will need to see several more times to sort of understand. There's a lot going on because there's a lot going on in this film. It wasn't an unmitigated disaster. I wasn't bored. Does it all come together? Absolutely not. I think the ideas are much more interesting than the execution. And speaking of the sort of the ego thing you were talking about earlier, this to me actually felt more like he was almost too collaborative. It sort of felt like the actors sort of had too much control. And I know there was a lot of experimentation he was doing on the set with letting kind of the actors kind of go wild and do their own thing. And then they would sort of decide collectively on the set which direction to go in. This is actually something that when he stepped away from mainstream filmmaking after The Rainmaker, all the rest of his films, he was very much focused on actors and acting and rehearsals. And this to me came through of like a little bit too much of that. Like I wish there was more of a singular vision on the sort of the style of this. It felt a little bit too all over the place. But I will say as well, and then I'll kind of jump into your thoughts before we get into it more deeply. The acting actually is what held this thing together for me. The story was kind of a mess, but the performances were so interesting, whether they were dumb and entertaining or just really kind of wild and out there, especially Shia LaBeouf was I thought just so interesting. Like I've never really liked him as much actually as I did in this movie. And also Aubrey Plaza I thought kind of stole the movie too. Like their performances kept me interested when the plot was kind of like what's going on? Why is this happening? So I don't know. The acting was almost is the thing I think should have been uh better, but also helped me through it. That was sort of my first impression. We
Mm.
just note to listeners, we did see this just last night, so it's been less than 24 hours, and this
Mhm.
movie's still like rattling around in my head. I actually had dreams about it last night, so it's gonna take a while to process this. But those are my immediate thoughts. What about you? What were your first impressions of it?
Yeah, very similar in the sense that it doesn't all come through. At the same time, I was not bored and I was definitely intrigued and something that I actually want to see again, just to kind of parse and kind of figure out a little bit more deeply. But I do think the movie has a lot of ideas and there's a lot going on to your point.
Hmm.
But I think where the ego things really comes in is that I think it's in the writing.
Yes,
And I
yes,
don't even mean the plot, but that too, but just also just the dialogues and how the movie is constructed. Like it feels very singular in terms of one man's vision and ideas. And I almost wish that he had somebody else writing the screenplay or some other collaborator to sort of keep, again, the same thing, constraints, and keep some checks and balances. Because there is, I think, an amazing, great movie in there
yeah.
somewhere. I
Hmm.
do think that. And I think there are moments where it really shines and soars and you're really intrigued because there's stuff happening at all levels. But overall, it's because the writing, I think, and then I'll get to the acting part, that it almost is laughable and that takes you out of it. It's just so on the nose, all these themes that he's talking about of utopia. And I know the movie is labeled as a fable, and I was thinking about that maybe I just don't like fable stories. I didn't like Poor
Yeah.
Things, which was labeled as a fable as well, and I
Hmm.
appreciate and admire a lot of the crafts elements and the performances, but I just have a tough time with that. But I also, on the flip side, sometimes also lazy, I think, because just because you're calling something a fable doesn't mean you just lay everything all on the nose. You still have to, you can still be subtle, even if you have a fable, and let the audiences sort of figure things out. I think that has a deeper impact. Again, this might be more of me, but
Yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah. I never
some
think
of
about
that
the
stuff
fable
that
thing.
just doesn't, it's just laughable. Some of these
Hmm.
lines and constructions and mountings are just laughable in my mind. But then on the acting side, I do agree, like it's sort of a company of actors kind of situation where there are a lot of people kind of in different movies in a way, and some of them really shine as others don't.
Yeah.
I know you're not a big Adam Driver fan. I've always been a big Adam Driver fan. And I think to me, the movie stands and is interesting because of his performance. Like he
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
I think, absolutely amazing. Like if you take him out of this movie, this whole movie will be a joke in my mind. I was thinking about his career in the last like 5 years. He's worked with every auteur director there is.
Hmm.
And a lot of those movies have not worked fully, for all sorts of reasons, whether it's House of Gucci or Annette or Noah Baumbach's movie, what have you. But he, in my mind, always comes out as a winner. And that just says so much about an actor. Like he commits totally, even though this whole movie feels like a play,
Yes, it definitely does.
and
Hmm.
how it's kind of mounted. It's
Hmm.
overstated and everything is pronounced and visually stimulating on top of the play acting. He commits,
Hmm.
and also looks amazing, I think, in the Caesar haircut. Like, how many people can say that? Most
Yeah.
people don't look good in that haircut. He looks great. And the lighting on him and the way his whole posture and poise is just absolutely incredible and sells the movie to me. Some of the other actors that you mentioned, I think Shia is great, like weird and eccentric,
So
fun.
interesting. Yeah.
I think, and
Yeah.
you need that. And I almost wish
Uh-huh.
that the movie had more of Cheyenne and Adam Driver sort of going off at each other.
Yeah.
That energy, whenever they were together on screen, there's something happening. And that's the other thing. Like a lot of these people are not fleshed out. And it's up to the actors who are good and are great, they're able to kind of fill in the blanks. Others, such as the leading lady, who I think is the weakest point of the entire movie. She's very beautiful, looks
Mm.
amazing, but is unable in my mind to carry. And all the laughability that I was talking about often seems to be, I got that from her the most. Partly it's the lines that are
Yeah.
given to her, but
Hmm.
also I don't think she's as good as a performer to kind of really carry that material, but also fill in the blanks where there's not much on the page and I mean, she has a pivotal role. She's the muse, she's the source of conflict that's happening. She's the one who's driving the story forward in so many
Hmm.
ways. She has a lot on her shoulders. And if there were a better or more seasoned performer there, I think this movie would have been 10 times better in my mind. And then I guess the cavalcade of old guys, I was not really into
John
that.
Voight, I thought was great.
He was actually pretty
He's
good, but
such a good
Dustin
actor, and
Hoffman,
Hoffman was yeah, he was brought in late. It was supposed to
I
be
know.
James Caan, but yeah, Hoffman was the part also. Just what was that? It was
What was that part
unnecessary.
exactly?
That part was unnecessary. But yeah, in terms of Natalie Emmanuel in that lead part, it's interesting because I felt that she has star power, and I'm really interested to see where her career goes. But in terms of this role, I did think the role just wasn't written well. And to me, the part of the movie that it latched onto the least was the love dynamic that was going on. So maybe that's just she's not, even though I think she has screen presence and was very interesting to look at, and I liked like watching her on screen, but she doesn't have the acting ability, I think, to make a part that is not
No.
fleshed out enough interesting. Or also too, maybe I was just more interested in the political machinations, like again, between Shia LaBeouf and Adam Driver and the whole like Catalan conspiracy update plot was what I was trying to follow, and the love thing just didn't. I didn't really understand like how she was amused or why she was that engaging to everyone. I mean, again, I felt Aubrey Plaza was a lot more interesting, and that role was just. I mean, I wanted a whole movie with her in it, like in
Although
that crazy WoW Platinum character. I don't know, that really
it's
worked
pretty
for me.
crazy.
It was
Yeah.
so I don't know, entertaining and fun.
Entertaining and fun, but I do think in a different movie. And I also
Yeah,
think she
yeah.
brings so much of her own baggage from what she's done in the past. I was like, oh, this is just April Ludgate, and plus, the White Lotus person or whatever, in Megalopolis. To me, it just felt like she's from a different thing that she's done so far. So it's a little bit on the nose casting. That said, very entertaining. I would totally watch that.
Yeah, her scene at the end with John Voight and Shia LaBeouf, not
Oh my
to kind of ruin
gosh.
it, a highlight. I think this scene will go down in
I
history
think
for
so
better
too.
or for worse in terms of what that was just amazing. The
That was
audience
pretty,
went wild for that. And
yeah,
again, I don't know if they were laughing at it or with it or what, or whether you were supposed to
both.
laugh with it. I didn't understand, but that's what made it so cool. So I agree with you about sort of Coppola's ego in the screenplay for sure. I mean, this definitely was his treatise on the human experience. Like you could tell this is like his magnum opus in terms of what he wants to really say about the human condition and the human spirit, which on paper, I'm like, yeah, I'm actually agree with that.
Yeah.
Would in a way like this would be my treatise as well on the future and focusing on that and not letting the past sort of dictate your future and always dream big and think about the optimistic things we could do as a human species. So I admire that more than I kind of thought it came through in a way that wasn't clunky. To your point, I think that was just a little bit too heavy-handed, a bit,
Oh yeah.
especially because I didn't think it fit well enough into the plot of kind of what was going on. I think the screenplay is what needed the most work here. In terms of visuals, though, I was very nervous going into this because the DP that he worked with on this movie has shot his last couple of the smaller independent movies
Mhm.
that he did, and I think those are some of the worst shot movies I've ever seen. They look worse than student films, and I don't blame Coppola as much as I blame the DP. So I was very worried about this movie, and actually I thought the visuals were really cool. I loved the split screen where it's like they split the screen into thirds to kind of show you different things going on at the same time. I loved the sequence when Adam Driver is going through the sort of the poorer parts of the city and those statues of like justice is falling down and crumbling and like all these. I thought that was just so amazing. So the visuals are definitely there enough. It just sometimes I wish they could have gone a little bigger and made it look sort of more overly dramatic because again, if you're calling yourself a fable, I want over the top stuff and
Right.
on the nose and like really big. And some of it was there and some of it wasn't. I don't know if that was budget or just he didn't have as much of the vision just because of the DPs working for it. I'm not sure. But then the craft side of things, this definitely felt like a big budget movie and something he hasn't done in a long time. I mean, I love the costumes, those jackets with the like the Roman like laurels along
Yeah.
the sides. I want to buy that. Like that is
Yeah.
so cool. The costumes were great. I thought the music was great. So like
Yeah.
everything else was sort of coming there. Just the script, I think, even though he's been working on it 40 years, maybe he's worked on it for too long.
That's the
Maybe
thing, you know.
too many drafts and too many revisions and sort of what his initial idea was sort of lost. I mean, I would love if he had done this in like 1984 or 85 and hadn't had that bankruptcy that happened after One from the Heart. I wonder what this movie could have been. Maybe this would have been another masterwork of his.
I agree. I agree on the visual. Like the movie looks very good actually. And the way people are lit, and I
Yeah,
like sort of
yeah.
the mix of kind of actual real world settings like buildings and such, but also, graphics and all of that. But then I think when this is spoiler alert, probably, but like as they start to show more of what Megalopolis is and this utopia, and most of it is CGI,
Hmm.
and sort of layering that with kind of creativity and all of his like life principles, like that's when I think the cheese starts to mount up in my mind, because it's like,
Mm,
okay, this is like too much, and none of the stuff looks very good though. It looks sort of amateur, to be honest.
mm,
Like, oh yeah,
mm.
of course this is what you imagined as utopia, with like grass and flowers and petals, and it reminded me of the sphere, Amazon sphere from
We're
Seattle. I was like,
we're
oh.
living in Megalopolis already. The sphere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was like, that's not very futuristic. Like, you should have imagined this a little more. Again,
Mm,
bring somebody else into your point. Like, this is why, going back to poor things, like, give Yorgos credit. Like, all the stuff that they built, real
true.
and CGI, is absolutely, you've never seen anything like that,
Mm,
and you want that wow factor from a movie
yeah.
like this that's supposed to be set in the future. And this looks sort of like an older person, I'm sorry to say, kind of imagining the future. But guess what? We're already there, so it just doesn't feel that reaching in my mind.
Yeah, like they had the Adam Driver and his wife are in this scene with Giancarlo Esposito and they're like in the future house and it's literally just a white room with curtains. This is the future. Yeah, though maybe he was try not to be too like predictive of this is what utopia would look like, just trying to make a vague sort of, yeah, it's something that looks kind of cool and futuristic, but he's not putting a lot of time into designing like Metropolis or something, because it is a fable and it's more broad strokes, and you just sort of put in a little bit of how you would imagine maybe Megalopolis would look like. But at the same time, from an execution standpoint, like you are waiting the whole movie like, oh, what is this cool new city going to look like? Other than the crumbling and the wealth inequality, I thought the actual current New Rome looked awesome. I love that
Yeah.
like Art Deco like mix of Roman stuff and modern New York City. I'm like I would live there if New York looked like that. I mean, again, beside all the problems and everything like that, but
Right.
I thought that was cool. Like I want to live in this world, but not necessarily utopia, which I don't think Coppola necessarily had that in mind. One thing I want to make sure that we discuss just for the listeners is I'm sure there's people have heard about the interactive experience that can happen at some of the screens. Now this isn't happening at all of them. Even heard in New York, I think there's only one screen a day that is doing this in one theater, and we were able to see the interactive experience that was. When I first read the stuff out of Cannes, the reviews, this was just like, wait, what? There's someone talking to the screen. So yes, we last night saw it at the Chinese and IMAX, Chinese theater here in Hollywood, and there was a moment in the movie about halfway through when the lights come up and there's a live person in the front with a microphone talking to Adam Driver's character on the screen. They had to like
Mm-hmm.
he asked the question, Driver responded. What did you think about that?
First, I thought, is the movie done? That can't be it. But then a part of me was like, oh, I actually wouldn't be surprised if the movie was done, because
Oh,
this
when the
is
lights
so
came up,
full
you
of
mean? Yeah.
yourself. Because at that point, I was definitely on the full of yourself,
Yeah.
train. So I was like, oh, maybe this is it. Okay, great. I get to go home early. I mean, it's kind of cool now that I think about it. It's also very gimmicky,
Yeah.
obviously. Did it really communicate anything? Did it really elevate the experience in any way or make a point? Not really. It's a cool thing to try, I suppose. Maybe it should have been longer,
Hmm.
perhaps, I guess, for it to really land. Like, it's not something I'm going to remember, to be honest, that this happened. But my sort of overall takeaway is that this is a thing of big swings,
Hmm.
and not all of them land. But I do give credit that, okay, they thought about doing something like that. And that's, you get points for that.
Yeah, yeah, I sort of felt the same way. I was hoping that it would have more resonance in just the film or what the theme of the movie was. Like I was trying to understand, and I still don't really understand why he did this. Because if you're gonna use a gimmick, it's gotta have some connection. And I don't know why having to talk to Adam Driver was what was that supposed to like make you a part of the movie somehow?
I
Like
think
I don't
that's
know.
the
That was
intention.
the
Yeah.
intention, you think? To make the
Yeah.
audience feel like you're part of this too, because we're all building the
Right.
utopia together.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Then to your point, maybe they should have leaned into it a little more. All it is one guy asking one question and him responding. I was hoping there'd be like a another question or some sort of dialogue between them would have been a little more ballsy
Right.
and interesting than just like one question and then one response.
I agree. It didn't even land as this was like a, pseudo live thing. Like there should
Hmm.
have been some back and forth that would have added to it. I mean, maybe he's also just trying to, in the whole like play theater like thing that
Yeah.
I think there's an element of that too at play, perhaps that, everybody who's sitting watching this is sort of part of it and such. So cool they tried, should have done maybe a little more.
Yeah, I was worried the whole movie like it wasn't gonna happen in our theater. So the second the lights came up and I saw the guy with the mic, I'm like, thank God, like I get to experience this because like maybe I won't see this again in a theater, though I definitely will see the movie again. And just sort of my overall take on this is again, it is a mess at times. I admire it a lot for what it's trying to do, and I definitely will be seeing this again. I mean, not in theaters probably, but I will be watching this and maybe it'll grow in my mind in terms of appreciation. I don't think it'll end up being like a hidden gem in his filmography, but I do think this will be talked about anytime someone talks about Coppola's filmography because it is that interesting of a piece, and I definitely recommend people see it
I
because
agree.
some people think it's great, other people think it's the worst thing they've ever seen, and those kind of things I always and look, he's a master, right? He's a master who's still around, so I do recommend people see it, even though I was not over the moon about it.
I feel similarly. I do recommend it. This year, I was thinking about this morning. We together have seen so many movies with so much hype, and frankly, a lot of them were disappointing,
Hmm.
mainly because I was just bored. And the thing with this is that it's not boring at all. I was
Right.
very engaged and entertained, and it's thought provoking. It doesn't always come together, but I'm actually excited to watch it again.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there are not that many movies this year where I can say that oh, I actually do want to see it again. So I'll give it that. And Adam Driver is amazing. That's
Yeah.
my other big takeaway.
Yeah,
Like if you
definitely.
can weather this and stand out to be triumphant, like that just says so much about who you are as an actor, as a person. I'm kind of in awe of that, I
Yeah,
think.
that definitely shout outs to him for sure. He did hold the movie together and ground it when it needed to be. I thought he did an excellent job. Oh, total side note, did you notice the woman behind us in costume?
Oh yeah.
That was cool. Someone came to our screening in sort of a new Rome outfit where it was she was sort
Yeah,
of
she
dressed like
had
a
grapes on her
I
head.
know, yeah, I respect that.
I
You're
wanted some, but yeah, I was also hungry. I had not had dinner, so I was like,
yeah.
pass me some grapes, please.
I was not expecting someone in Megalopolis costume. Maybe she
No,
should have gone up and asked the question. They should have
I think she had seen this movie before. Like that whole group behind us, they were
yeah.
laughing. I think this was their third time watching it or something. Who knows? Or maybe they came from the Coppola winery. They were fired, so they came here. I don't know. And that's how she has the grapes.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, she took some of the grapes out. Yeah, good wine, by the way. Shout out to Coppola Winery. I think they do a good job. Okay, so now that we've discussed Megalopolis, let's go back over Coppola's entire career. Well, not entire career, but talk about our standout films in his career. So this is something we do in every episode. We go over our top three. So first, we're going to talk about our first love, and this is the first Coppola film that left a lasting impression on us and potentially made us fall in love with him as a director. Then the masterpiece. This is the movie that resonates with us the most. And then finally, the wild card, a movie that is important to us in another way, hidden gem, big swing, which a lot of big swings in Coppola's career for sure, or just another film we want to bring to the table to discuss when we are talking about Coppola. So to get things started, Karan, why don't you talk about your first love of Francis Ford Coppola? What do you got for us?
Yeah, so for me, this is the first movie relatively grown up. Like I probably was a teenager or something at this time that I saw, which is The Rainmaker from 1997, directed by Coppola, obviously, starring Matt Damon, Danny DeVito, Claire Danes. Quick logline: an underdog lawyer takes on a fraudulent insurance company. I've always loved these John Grisham adaptations back then when I was a teenager or in my 20s, but also as a grown up. I watched this movie actually not knowing that this is directed by the director who made the Godfather movies for sure. But It's definitely in my mind of the John Grisham adaptations, and I watched it because I like Matt Damon. This is sort of, when he's sort of up and coming and
Yeah.
such. And watching it again this time kind of made me remember why this made an impact on me and probably stands out in all those Grisham adaptations, even though this is not my favorite Grisham adaptation. I like The Firm or Pelican Brief or those movies much better actually
Mm.
than this one. I've not revisited this for a reason. That said, though, it has the Coppola quality, which I've been thinking about a lot. Even with the Godfather movies, is that it's intimate and expansive and epic at the same time, and he's so good at that, even though like you mentioned, like after this movie he basically called it quits. So
Right.
it probably was not a happy time, but I think he is able to get to the heart of these people, this place, this time, and what they're going through. Not all of it comes together, specifically some of the Claire Danes elements and that relationship, and I was like, what is even going on? It's like a little bit of sort of misery porn in
Yeah.
some ways. And a lot of the storylines where Matt Damon is involved trying to kind of help these people out and such is like that. It's schmaltzy in that sense. That said, there is like a beating heart to it, and the story is pretty engaging. You are intrigued. The performances are overall pretty good. But what I take away the most is sort of the epicness and the intimacy, kind of at the same time. And that's one of his signature things. So I wouldn't call it a first love. It was more like watching a Grisham adaptation, but instantly feeling that it stands out
Hmm.
because of that epic nature of it, which I don't think comes through in the other ones that I actually prefer. They feel sort of thrillery, fast paced, and more sort of about the plot beats, if you will, versus this feels a little bit just like lay back and let this movie kind of wash over you. Sort of, it has this sort of, maybe it's the place too because it's set in the South, I think, right?
Believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it
Yeah.
has that sort of feeling of like humidity and like a good lazy sort of vibe to it, which I kind of enjoy. It's like a good afternoon movie to watch, I think. So that's why I put this on my list, because this is the first movie I saw, and it did make a impression on me. Had you seen this before?
Yeah, so this movie I'd seen as a kid too, and it might have been potentially the first Coppola movie I saw as well. I don't
Mhm.
know if I saw this one or the movie I'm going to be talking about next, Apocalypse Now, first, but definitely this movie, if I did see it first, was not because Coppola directed it.
Right,
This was one of those, like, it's a Friday night VHS rental time, go to the video store. Okay, I also like those John Grisham thrillers, those legal thrillers. So it's like, oh,
right.
get this. And I remember I hadn't seen it. I saw it last year on my Coppola rewatch. I hadn't seen it since then. I remembered the movie being a lot better than it was upon the rewatch last year and then the rewatch that I just did for this podcast. I remember really liking it because I'm a big fan of the stick it to the man genre of movies where there's an evil corporation and
Right.
somehow the evil corporation loses at the end and they get screwed. Like that's like my favorite type of genre, especially the legal genre. So I had a memory of those beats of it a lot more than the rest of it because I think you're right. Like the Claire Danes stuff doesn't really work, but I definitely agree with you in terms of the Coppola approach to the Grisham books. And actually, I think for me, this is my favorite of the Grisham adaptations. Actually,
Oh
I
yeah.
think the other ones that you mentioned, The Firm or like A Time to Kill, they focus a lot more on the page turner pulp novel aspect
Right.
of what John Grisham does. And I think what this movie does is it does take a step back and focuses on more of the characters. It's like, what
Yeah.
is Matt Damon's journey? How is Danny DeVito's? What is his journey? Why are they kind of doing this? And it's not so much about the plot beats and like, oh no, there's like someone with a knife around the corner or like
Right.
all the stuff that Grisham does put in his books. I mean, I've never actually read the books. I will have to admit, but my mom was a huge fan of them, so I was always surrounded by them as
Mm.
a kid, and I knew Grisham through these other movies, which I always thought were a lot more cheesy and pulpy.
Yeah.
Not in a bad way. That's just kind of what his style is. I think Coppola and his approach to this movie was kind of pulling those layers back. I mean, maybe the layers weren't there in the original book. I don't know. But the only thing that doesn't really work for me is all that Claire Danes stuff, which sort of feels unnecessary. I guess it's in there to sort of show what a good guy Matty Damon's character is because he's doing these other things out of the goodness of his heart and not just going after the insurance company for the money. I think that must be the sort of the point of that. But the cast is stacked.
Oh
Like
yeah.
not only DeVito and Matty Damon, but John Voight. We just talked about John Voight in Megalopolis. He's great in this. Danny Glover just solid as
Yeah,
a cool
amazing.
judge. Mickey Rourke in the beginning of the movie, I think, does a
Right.
fantastic job as like the sleazy sort of ambulance chasing lawyer. So I think this again shows Coppola can bring in the great actors. They all do great performances. And he does able to do exactly what you said, big drama, but also focus on the characters. And I think this movie is a very solid kind of base hit kind of movie. Like he needed it because he needed the money. And this, once he collected that money, he sort of stepped away from Hollywood after this for basically forever. I mean, he hasn't really gone back and made a mainstream film since then. Even Megalopolis was independently financed, like we said. But I think this is an admirable kind of last movie, if this is the last one he makes in mainstream Hollywood to do. This is like a solid, yeah, yes, it's
Yeah,
paint by numbers, but he elevates it in a certain way.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, it sort of feels like, to a point, like a serious sort of drama picture
Hmm.
rendition of a Grisham novel.
Yeah, yeah.
I prefer the pulpy sort of page turnery, because that's, I mean, not that I've read those books, but that's what those books are. And
Right,
that's
right,
why
right.
The Firm is bonkers, but I
It's
love it so
it's
much
so
for
dumb.
it.
Yeah,
I love it.
it's oh yeah, no, it's like I'm not taking away from. I mean, I love Tom, but yeah, we saw
Yeah,
that movie we talked about on the podcast
I
last
know.
year. First time I'd seen it, just bonkers. Like,
I
what the
know. I
hell is
love
this
it so
movie?
much.
But
But this is,
yeah,
it's a different tone and different vibe. And I think, yeah, if this is the last mainstream Hollywood picture you're gonna make, that's pretty good actually. Solid.
yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's definitely his. You can say this is part of his quote unquote journeyman director phase of just sort of
Right.
taking whatever he can get. But I think that's selling it a little bit short. I think he
There's
does
more there.
yeah, exactly. He does put a little more into this. So I think the you cut out the Claire Danes stuff. I think this would be much higher ranked in sort of his filmography. But even with it in, I think it's a solid Coppola that I do recommend people, especially like in legal thrillers, could check this out.
All right. What is your first love?
So my first love is Apocalypse Now from 1979. The IMDb plot summary: a U.S. Army officer serving in Vietnam is tasked with assassinating a renegade special forces colonel who sees himself as a god. So co-written and directed by Coppola, starring Martin Sheen, Marlon Brando, and Robert Duvall, and Dennis Hopper. We'll say Harrison Ford too is in this as well.
Right.
And Scott Glenn too, a young Scott Glenn. A lot of people in this actually. So this was the a movie that I'd known about, much like The Godfather, growing up as this adult, like ultimate war movie was always sort of what it was in my head. And I didn't come to this until I was in my late teens and decided, okay, I think I'm ready to check out what this movie is because I'd heard so much about it, and all of it was just praise. Like every adult was like, "Oh, this is the best war movie ever. Oh, this is the most incredible movie ever." So I did have really high expectation to it going in. And I remember my first impressions of it were that, wow, this is just such a big movie with a lot going on. And I remembered liking it, though not loving it because at the time, like to me, war movies I wanted to be super realistic, and this definitely was not one. This is not meant to show you what it was like to fight in the Vietnam War. Like I was a lot more into like, oh, Platoon and like I want to know what it was like kind of thing. And I sort of docked it a little bit of points for that. I didn't appreciate or understand the surrealist elements that this movie brings in and what it actually really is about, which is the heart of darkness inside every human is sort of what it's
Mhm.
trying to do, and not say, oh, the Vietnam War sucked, which is sort of the types of movies that I was enjoying more at the time. So I've seen it multiple times since then. I think now it is one of my favorite movies, and I think one of the top 10 best movies ever made in terms of what it can pull off. And the closest sort of analogy to this in terms of another movie to me is 2001, where that movie also it's like a journey and a trip you're going on. It's an experience. It's not only just the movie. And
Mhm.
this movie is also an experience. It isn't just a movie. It's like, I mean, I've never taken LSD, but I would imagine it's like going on an acid trip, but an acid trip into darkness as opposed to 2001, which is more like about sort of the hope and the future of humanity. And this is definitely horrible creatures
Mhm.
who do horrible things. But I'll talk more about it because there's so much to discuss in this film. But when did you first see this movie, and what are your impressions of it?
Yeah, I avoided this movie for the longest time, so I finally watched it last week for this podcast, because I just had heard
Oh,
great things,
cool.
but also that it's a tough watch, and it's an experience, like you said, and you need to dedicate time and what have you for it, and that's why I kept avoiding it. But I was blown away, like you said, like this movie from the very moment it starts, like not just a journey and experience. It is that, but it's a bit of a fever dream, kind
Hmm.
of what you're saying with if somebody was on an acid trip. Obviously, technically, and the way it's mounted, the way it looks and feels, is you're totally transported. But also, what it ends up communicating about humanity and what we are capable of and the dark side, it shows it, but it's sort of more felt,
Hmm.
like it's not a war movie in the sense that, oh, we're going to show all the evils of war and make a statement. It sort of feels a lot more in the head, if you will, to the point that after watching the movie, I almost was like, was this even real? Like, did this even happen? Did Martin Sheen even go there? Or is Brando's cave even a thing? Like it just has this quality to it. And of course, it's the crafts across the board, it's the performances, but also I think there's something about the narrative device of the movie, which is Martin Sheen's voice kind
Hmm.
of telling us about what is happening and how he's learning about Brando and the letters and the research, and he's also this kind of numb person who's probably not right in his head because already he's been back, and that's how the movie starts. Like you're in his point of view, so it's that classic kind of unreliable narrator sort of thing that's going
Hmm.
on, but then you're also there yourself. So it's a trip, in all sense of the word, and you're on this journey. And but you're right, at the end of it, you just sort of, it's a very dark movie. You're wowed by it, but you're also in the deep hole of realizing what we are capable of,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter really. I say this with caution because obviously this happened. There are real people who had a terrible time. So many lives were lost. And I understand the criticisms of it doesn't display things with accuracy, but I don't think it's going for that.
Right. It's not. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'll be the one to say and get hate for it that it doesn't matter actually, because this is not a documentary. It's a movie that has a take on what happened more from like a human point of view.
Right. I think it's trying to capture the emotion of what it
Right.
feels like to descend into your own madness and your own dark side. I mean, it's
Right.
the war brings out the worst in people. I mean, you're killing other human beings for
Exactly.
somebody else, and that obviously can drive you crazy in many ways. And I think that's what a lot of Brando's character is realizing that. The whole a lot of that narration is always this great guy and he's a good family man and everything's great and like what happened to him. And I think because he saw the darkness of what war can bring out, he goes crazy. And I think that is also what, as an audience, you're kind of going through that same journey too. Like you said, it's not spelling things out or showing a lot necessarily, like putting a spotlight on it. It'll do it in really kind of subtle ways. I mean, there's that amazing sequence, obviously, of Robert Duvall where he's trying to clear the beach so they can go surfing, and you see
Mm.
him talking in the foreground to the soldiers, oh, talking about the surf, oh, you the surfing guy or whatever, and then just in the background you see all these Vietnamese villagers just getting lined up by the troops and killed and put away and all this stuff. It's like the horrors of everything is just going around in the background, but the movie's not necessarily focusing on that. It's there and you can see it, and it's just the callousness, the way the movie's even treating that sometimes is what also makes it so horrific. Like these awful things are
I
going
agree.
on all around, but the movie's not really showing you that because it's not about that. It's about what these characters do, but it's all there. And I think that is also adds to the effect as an audience member in terms of what this movie does to you. Because even though it deals with a lot of dark things, I don't want to say like an enjoyable experience, but I like coming back to this movie. Whereas other movies, I know we talked about them sometimes on the podcast where they're just too nihilistic for me, and I just can't even enjoy. Sounds weird, but I can't even sit through the movie and have such an
Hmm.
adverse reaction. This movie is so mesmerizing in a
Right.
weird kind of like calming way, kind of, even though these are like the darkest parts of what humans can do. It's a lot of that is due to, said, the voiceover, also the cinematography by Vito Storaro is some of the best like I've ever seen,
Unbelievable.
especially towards the end when you're coming into Marlon Brando's tribe and the temples and just it's unbelievable. It just sucks you in that way, but it's also kind of calming in this weird. It's like, yeah, you feel like you're on drugs or something.
That's the thing. It's a field trip kind of movie. But also, like, to what you're saying earlier, like Brando is sort of in that character. We're seeing this is kind of the darkest side of where you could go to.
Hmm.
But everybody's on that journey,
Yes.
actually,
Hmm.
from the very beginning. Everybody is sort of numb and the callousness of what's happening. And it's subtle in that sense, but it's also kind of real while being surrealistic. I kept imagining that, okay, if these people have been away from home, they've been doing this, they didn't want to be there in the first place, they've
Right.
been living this way, what they're eating, what they're drinking, what have you, you will sort of then start to make light of whatever you're doing. And it's not just like the dark side in you, but just the numb side in you, which numbness can lead to joy in a weird
Hmm.
way as well. It's all kind of interwoven, and you see that with all these people without it being spelled out. And
Right.
in some ways, to your point of like it's a calming experience, I don't know if they intended it to be this way, but the audience is also kind of culpable. They're part of watching this.
Right.
The fact that you can enjoy it in a way and kind of just lay back and relax, it sort of intentionally or unintentionally makes the point that, oh yeah, you're also now callous, because we all have that dark side in us, or we all
Right.
have that numb side in us that kind of gets turned on when you're watching this movie. So it's deeper because of that, I think.
Absolutely. In the same way that I think what this movie is saying too is we all have this darkness in us, but it's the conditions around us, our material conditions that bring that out. And war is
Yeah.
one of those things that bring out the worst in humanity. And as an audience member too, the conditions of watching this movie sort of bring out your numbness in the same way. So I totally agree. I think that definitely works. And just the way that, again, the movie just there's no credits in the beginning or the end of
Mm-hmm.
this movie. There was some, I can't remember how he got this. There was some fight he had to do to get so there's no one's get. Oh, I know. I remember what it was now. When this movie first came out, they handed out paper credits to the audience members in the theater to get
Huh.
around the fact that the unions were like, you have to credit all the people that worked on this. And he didn't want to put it in the movie at all because that would ruin the trip and the experience of making it feel artificial in some way instead of just diving right into that. The
Mm.
brilliant use of the Doors song. I mean, I think
Oh,
one of the
amazing.
best uses of a song in any movie is the beginning and also the end. The end, not a pun, because the use of the song,
Yeah.
the end, but at the end of the movie, and the end at the beginning of the movie, just absolutely incredible. But just the fact that it ends at the end and there isn't a credit sequence, just
Yeah.
again makes it feel a lot more like some sort of acid trip or an experience, and not even a movie. It does live up to the hype, I think. At least it did for me when I first watched
I
it. Of
totally did.
something that is just unlike anything else you've ever seen. And I don't think a movie ever can be made like this again. I mean, you mentioned this in the opening, but there's a brilliant documentary by Coppola's wife, it's Heart of Darkness. I think it's Heart of
Yeah,
Darkness,
something like that.
which I don't know if you've seen that. You should watch it
Yeah.
now that you've seen the
Yeah.
film. It's just insane. What I mean, there's like a 3 year process of filming this movie. They were using the real Filipino military that during shoots had to go off and fight a real war. So that sometimes they'd lose the helicopters because they'd have to go off and do something else. I mean, this movie will never get made in the same way again. The scale of this, I mean, with the Ride of the Valkyrie sequence, all those
Right.
helicopters and all those explosions. I mean, everything had to be done practically. And that too, when I'm watching this, I'm just like just in awe of the production, which elevates it even more in my mind. I mean, this is definitely it's a trip. Like to go back to
Yeah.
that analogy again too. Oh, I also will note as well, he's recut this movie several times over the years, which is something that he's done a lot. And I think actually he's really bad at recutting his films. I saw Apocalypse Now Redux when it came out in the theaters in like 2001 or whatever. I just don't think it's as good, and the final cut isn't as good. Coppola keeps messing with his works, and I think the originals are always the best. That's just my personal opinion. Hopefully, you saw the original version when
I
you.
saw the original,
Okay.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I've heard that too. At like they brought in a lot of like history and such and
Hmm.
more backstory, and you don't need that. It sort of
No.
takes away from the trip fever dream part of this. But going back to the documentary, I do want to watch that. But again, from what I've heard and read, like there's innovation, there's genius, and there's commitment, and will do anything and whatever it takes to kind of get this done. At the same time, a lot of ego too, and
Yes.
like there's cheating and putting your family and your wife and your own life and everything on the line. There's a lot about him, I think it seems, that comes through from this whole experience, which I'm excited to kind of dive into more.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He says it sort of. what the movie's about, he'll become that at that time. And in
Mm,
this movie, he said
gosh.
it. He felt like he was Colonel Kurtz in terms of going mad in his own journey of obsession in the jungle over 3 years. And I mean, it almost killed him. And I mean, it would have bankrupted him if this movie wasn't as successful as it was. That happens on his next movie that we'll talk about in a little bit. But this movie is, I mean, what more can you say to your point you mentioned earlier in the episode? I mean, this is one of the greatest movies ever made and continues to. Every time I see it, I love it even more for different ways.
It's incredible. I mean, the fact that it came together and exists is sort of a miracle, you
I
know?
know.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so going from Apocalypse Now, which arguably could be a masterpiece in some
Yeah.
people's mind, let's go on to our own personal masterpieces. So, starting with you, Karan, what's your personal masterpiece for Francis Ford Coppola?
This is not a surprise, and I could pick one or the other one. But my masterpiece is Godfather, the first one from 1972, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, obviously, starring Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, James Caan, Diane Keaton, a stacked cast. Quick logline, as if anybody needs to know. The aging patriarch of an organized crime dynasty transfers control of his clandestine empire to his reluctant son. Like I said, I mean, I could pick this one or the second one. I think I've seen this one more times, and maybe that's sort of why I picked this. And honestly, what's there to say about these movies, right? We've been hinting at these movies since the moment we started recording because they're
Yeah.
just such a iconic part of not just American movie canon, but movies in general. I love and hate, I should say, the four favorites letterbox thing that goes around, and invariably the Godfather Part 1, Part 2 are in those for
Hmm.
pretty much anybody and everybody. It doesn't matter what age you are, where you come from, they're always in there. And that there's a reason for that. I think the reason why I maybe slightly prefer this one over the other one is because we are meeting all these people the first time. And
Hmm.
there's something about that. And there's something about specifically the dynamic between Brando and Al Pacino. And maybe I'm sort of just leading with the buried lead, which is that this is probably one of, if not the best performance put by an actor on screen in Al Pacino's
Hmm.
performance. Like it's just absolutely incredible. What's to say more about this movie? I feel like I'm like circling around, which is that it's perfect, right? In terms of how it's mounted, how it looks and feels, all its themes on family, relationships, the entire mise en scène, every department sort of, killing it on and running on all cylinders. It's deep, but it's also very watchable and kind of pulpy. And I would say this about both the movies. I think the
Hmm.
second one is maybe a little bit more pulpy. It depends on what side of the bed you wake up. Because if you pull out certain scenes and lines from the movies, I guess they become so memeified now and they're so in the culture. Maybe that's part of it. But Mario Puzo's books are pulpy.
Right,
And I
right.
think that's where you and I, we often talked about this, like Hitchcock and such, which is that some of the great art that's all encompassing cultural milestones that are part of our fabric for generations are often based on material that is pulpy, which just makes it more relatable. But then when it's elevated with depth and the mise en scène coming together in such a way, it just makes it indelible. But, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about there are movies of this caliber that have been made. What is it about this one and the second one that makes them endure the way they do? You could say this about the David Lean movies. You could say this about Kubrick movies. You could say this about Hitchcock movies. And yes, they are very much part of our culture, but
Hmm.
they're not the same way that these two movies are. And I haven't given it like a ton of thought, but my first thought is that I think it's because it's about family and who we are as a human species. These themes of leaving home, wanting a better home, wanting to be close with somebody in the family, wanting to follow the footsteps of your father or your mother, which kid lives up and which doesn't,
Hmm.
who takes on the legacy. These are universal themes that we've been living with and fighting with since the beginning of times. And maybe that's what is about these movies that endures. And I'll pass the mic to you, but the last thing I would say is that before I sat down to watch these movies again, and this one especially, in my head, even though I know this, of course, because they're iconic set pieces like the wedding scene and
Oh
the
yeah.
horse and
Hmm.
all of that, all I think about the movie when I'm not watching it is Brando sitting in his room talking to people, well
Mm.
dressed men talking in a lower volume. And
Hmm.
then when I watch it, every time I'm surprised by how epic these movies are, which again takes me back to what I was saying about the Rainmaker. Of course, these two movies are the epic examples of that, which is that they're so epic in scope and scale, but yet they're so intimate. It was so mind-boggling again to watch this movie because I hadn't seen it in a few years of like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, this is huge. And even though I know the big scenes are in there,
Hmm.
I just don't think of them. I think about the family dynamics and the lines and the looks between characters because they're deep character studies while being in these larger themes and this epic scale, which is just so hard to do. And how young he was, it's just, I don't know. It's overwhelming to think about and talk about these movies.
Yeah, I mean it's just my we talked about this movie already in the our
Yeah,
family episode, so I'll post the link below for that. So I've talked about how, again, I think you're right. This does hit on these universal themes of family and and sort of maximizes the drama of that. And that's what makes it, I think, endure cross cultures and just for all time and every generation, because these are
hmm,
issues that always are there. If you have a family, these things will come up. Not obviously to the extreme of this movie where, your family members are getting killed and involved in clandestine activities, but it says a lot about what family means. So I think that is probably why it endures
yeah,
so much. And so then, I've talked about the family piece of it a lot. So the other kind of layer is what I associate a lot with both of these movies, but we'll get into Godfather 2 in a bit. Spoilers on that one. Is I think a lot of this, at least in America, it resonates so much because these movies are, and this movie specifically is a lot about the American dream and
right,
what that means and the allure of it, the reality of it, and a lot of the downsides and the dark sides of it.
yeah.
You're trying to make it rich at all costs, I guess so, because you're now involved in illegal activities. Though you always have to be innovating and changing to keep up with your competition. And Marlon Brando's character in this movie decides he doesn't want to get into drugs. He has a higher standards, even though that's where the market is moving. He doesn't want to play in that, and then that's what gets him assassinated or attempted assassination, and all the drama kind of stems from him refusing to innovate in bringing in drugs into his criminal activities instead of just gambling. They look upon that as not as big of a vice as drugs, which actually can cause, real harm. Though gambling can too. I don't mean to
Hmm.
diminish the issues with that, but I think potentially that is why these movies, this one in particular, resonates so much, at least in American culture, because there is a lot of that. Go get him. I want to do, start my own thing, do something innovative, go after, get rich. Is a lot of what drove these characters. I mean, it gets into more of the history of it in the next movie, which we'll get into. But this one, I think, is a lot of that allure of just Michael too, of just trying to stay out of that, but then eventually gets pulled into it, and then he enjoys it. And a lot of it is the
Hmm.
power, but also it's the success of what he gets into as he becomes the new Don, essentially by the end of this movie. So I think that's another layer that I always associate with this movie. Not only because of the opening monologue, where it's like, this is what I love about America, like
Right.
that famous monologue, but I do think this is a lot to reflective on the American culture, especially of the 20th century.
Yeah.
It's another thing I think
But
why it
even those
resonates.
themes are universal, America sort of symbolizes, and we've talked about this before, America is very good at marketing.
Right.
And there's truth to that too, if on an average, the American dream, there are more true stories of that coming to fruition here than other places,
That's
probably. I
mm,
don't know.
yeah. I think
It, or
they like
maybe
you to
it's just marketing again.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. We don't need to get this into be our
Right.
America episode part 4 yet, but yeah, I think it is universal, but I think America, maybe this is just me speaking as an American, represents those things to a lot of the rest of the world. So because
Hmm.
this movie involved that, at least in my mind, I associate that with America, even if it might just be, the marketing, which, I do think it is. But yeah, like you said, like what can you say? I mean, I think the acting is some of the best acting in any movie. I mean, Brando being 47 and playing this role where he looks like he's like 60. And I think this might be his greatest performance, or
Right.
maybe Apocalypse Now, honestly. We didn't really touch on him too much in that last discussion, but I think that also performance is just totemic. But this is just something else. Like what he's able to pull off in this is just being very subtle too, and sort of quiet and understated. But you can see the intelligence of what Vito's thinking about and doing, and how he cares about his family, but at the same time he's kind of putting them in jeopardy by pulling them into the business. It's just a fascinating performance. I just want to call him out because I agree with you on the Pacino thing. That is, every time I see it, I just have more
Blown away.
respect for what he was able to do. I mean, that restaurant scene alone when he has to kill the rival and the police officer is just some of the best acting you will ever see
Yeah.
anywhere. Just
Yeah.
stunning.
And then we cannot not mention the brothers dynamic, right? Like
Oh
how
yeah.
these three people are, again, amazing performances in James Caan and Cazale.
Hmm.
That whole dynamic is absolutely incredible. And of course, it gets fleshed out even more in the second movie. But then it's also about the little moments, food being cooked and how people are eating and celebrating each other or knocking each other down. And it just all feels so organic and real. It's almost like watching somebody else's lives that mirrors your own life in a way, even though our lives are nothing like this, obviously. But there's almost like a reality TV kind of quality to it in a way that whenever I watch a scene somewhere, I have to watch the whole thing because you sort of get pulled into it.
Right, exactly. I think that was why Coppola was hired, because he was an Italian American, and the studio wanted that authenticity
Right.
in the movie, and he was brought in. And I think this is not something that anyone thought would be successful. They also were breaking a lot of ground too. I mean, the cinematography in this movie with all of
Yeah.
the shadows and the darkness that they were able to do was very innovative at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
something that and now every movie sort of has that type of look to it. Or not every movie, but it's much more prevalent now than it was back then. So this again shows how he was innovating and trying to push boundaries and, again, elevating that pulping material, like you said. It's a lot of crazy on-set studio issues back and forth of this, but
Yeah.
he fought for his vision, and this put him on the map, honestly. Just making this, I think, just put him in the pantheon of Hollywood, and then he followed it with three other incredible movies with Conversation, Godfather 2 and Apocalypse Now, like that run. But it all started here, which you can feel, at least when I watch it, that this is sort of like that lightning in a bottle thing of all these people, sort of these elements coming together almost by accident and
Yeah.
not cooked up in a lab. It's just like almost like, someone accidentally mixed some chemicals together in the lab and then you get something incredible. That organic feel is what I get out of this. Like it doesn't feel like, oh, I have this specific vision that I want to do. Like you can kind of feel the improvisation that was going on amongst the actors in Coppola where they're trying to just kind of figure it out. And that I think is a lot of part of his style and what makes this movie still feel fresh to me every time I see it. It never feels old. And every sudden death and murder still hits me, even though I know it's coming,
Right.
and it still feels shocking, especially when his wife in Italy gets blown up. Every time I'm
Yeah.
just like, it gets me, even though I know it's coming. But just the power of this film. I mean, you can't talk more good about it. I mean, hopefully everyone who's listening to this has seen it. If you haven't, definitely get out there and set aside a whole day, really. I mean, I watch all three every time. I can't just watch one. I get sucked into the world and I don't want to leave it. So I then, watch two and then three. And then after three, I'm like, I'm done with this world now because three's not that great. It's okay. I think it gets crapped on a little more than it should. But
I've
yeah,
never seen it.
you should see it. You definitely should see it. I think there's a lot of things that are great in it,
Mm.
but it feels like they were going for a very different thing in three than they were with the first two. But you definitely should see. I actually, even though we didn't have to watch three for this podcast, I took an afternoon and watched all three because I can't just go in a little bit. I just want to stay in this world just because of what Coppola's constructed here is so
Yeah,
special.
I agree, especially with the first two. Like, I've stopped now thinking about which one is better because they are a package. It's one movie, it's one story that has to be consumed that way.
Hmm.
That said, I think it is the organicness, like you were saying. There's something about that, and there's just Brando being part of it, and you're
Oh
being
yeah.
introduced to this new world. It just feels there's something maverick and fresh and tighter as a result of that with this movie versus the second one, though amazing and great, obviously. It just feels like, okay, now this person has wings,
Mm.
versus in this movie, I don't think he has his wings yet fully.
Mm-mm.
And yet it's
No.
just so compelling. And there's something about that that draws me in a little more, just a tad.
Yeah, and maybe then one of this is the classic film fan debate of which Godfather's better.
Right.
I tend to go with two, and maybe we can jump into my
Let's
masterpiece
do
then
it.
of Godfather 2. So this is the sequel to Godfather, obviously from 1974. The plot summary: the early life and career of Vito Corleone in the 1920s New York City is portrayed, while his son Michael expands and tightens his grip on the family crime syndicate. Co-written by Ford Coppola, obviously directed by him. Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Robert Duvall, John Cazale, and Diane Keaton star. So just to continue the conversation we were having, I agree with everything you said about Godfather 1. And to me, what makes 2 a better a movie that I think is better, at least when I watch it, is just that you take something that you almost feel like you can never achieve the heights of what Godfather 1 did. And what Coppola then does in this movie is not rest on his laurels and kind of give you a part two that you would expect. But I
Hmm.
think the real innovation here of pulling in the backstory
Yeah.
of Marlon Brando's character, Vito, from the first movie and intercutting it into the story of how Michael now really goes to the dark side and becomes just an absolute demon by the end of this movie is what is so innovative and fascinating and just elevates this work to me even more because of that parallel father-son story is
Hmm.
just it's so what an incredible idea and device. I mean, maybe he didn't necessarily think of this, but he definitely popularized this format of cutting back and forth between the past and the present that cribbed on now like in TV shows and movies, and it's a classic formula, but it's not something anyone ever would expect it to be done with this, and to make it a sequel, which at the time was not something that you would normally do, especially with a drama. Like there wasn't this ethos there is now in modern Hollywood of like, oh, we got to make everything, we have to give out 14 of
Hmm.
these, and did not make it feel cheap.
Yeah.
And I think also this contains some of the greatest, I think, most powerful scenes in movie history. With I think Al Pacino here actually is slightly better because of some of these scenes than in the first movie, even, which is like I go back and forth between which one he's better in. But the scenes where he admits to Fredo that he knows that it was him that betrayed him in Cuba, like that moment is just
Mm.
every time I think it's just one of the most powerful things put on screen. And then the
Chilling.
discussion at the end of the movie between Pacino and Diane Keaton, where she admits that she had
Yeah.
an abortion. And the acting in his face when she's telling him this and how he processes it is, I think, just absolutely stunning. And those two scenes too are just so powerful and just incredible and knock me over every time. Every time I see this movie, even though again I know that they're coming, but I'm almost like waiting for those moments because I don't think you can get drama done in that way in cinema. I think those are the two best examples to me of like what drama is and what it can be. So I'll have more to say, but I'll pause there in terms of your Godfather 2 thoughts. I mean, obviously, it's always the tough choice between between these two. I just always tend to fall on the side of Godfather 2.
Yeah, that is the popular answer. And I see it, right? Like I said up front, I could
Yeah,
pick this one or the other one
yeah,
depending on, what mood I am in. But yeah, everything you said, right? That this could have not gone well. And the fact that he upset in this way is never really been done in this fashion, even since. I don't think there are that many sequels that sort of up the ante and
no, yeah.
probably are better than the first one.
I think this is the only
This is
example
the
in
only
my
example.
mind. I mean, some people say Empire Strikes Back, but I
Right.
think this is the truer debate in my mind of
Yeah.
Godfather 1 versus Godfather 2. And I don't think there's a wrong answer, honestly. It's
There's no
just kind
wrong
of
answer.
fun, except Godfather 3 would be the wrong answer. But
Right.
it's kind of fun to talk about these two movies because they are just so
Yeah.
totemic. And the other thing I just also think this movie just works for me a lot more is that not only is it just the American story, which the first one was a lot about America, but this is more about the immigrant story, which is
Right.
obviously also woven into America too. But I love sort of I think this is one of the best sort of depictions of that, where you leave your home country and all the troubles behind. He's completely new, literally a new name he gets when he comes in through Ellis Island because I think they just give him the last name of Corleone because that's where he's from. And he just builds his own life completely on his own. Yes, it's a criminal empire. So, but he makes his way on his own and creates all this success in America by leaving behind all of these troubles that he had in back in Italy. And I love the scene too where he comes back and gets his revenge on the guy that killed his family. I
Oh
always
my
find that
gosh. Yeah.
that really powerful too. And a big shout out to De Niro in this. I think
Yeah.
he's fantastic. And actually on this rewatch, I was thinking if this movie was made now or even like 10 or 15 years after, they would have tried to put him in makeup to make him like look like Marlon Brando, and he would have been doing like a Marlon Brando impersonation. And I shudder to think that if they made this now, they would just use someone to de-age,
Oh my
like put like a
gosh,
Marlon
yeah.
Brando face on him, like the Marvel movies and things like that. But I just love how this movie, he's the same guy, and you can feel this is the same character, but it's not an imitation. It's not he's trying to crib on what Brando was doing. It's his own version of Vito that feels like this younger Vito, and I think that is just a masterclass in acting.
It really is. And I think what you were saying earlier, like the whole time back and forth is just so elegantly handled. Because even that, right, the mirroring of stories can feel very heavy handed, but it
Yes.
doesn't. It
Hmm.
feels very elegant. You're never confused or lost about why are we there, which time is which. It's super clear, but yet it just feels so fluid and seamless. It's just almost like magical to have see that transition go back and forth. And then I think the epicness of this movie really, to me, ups the ante. Like the Cuba scenes,
Oh yeah.
Havana, and you see more of Tahoe and their life and their state, and they go to Florida. Like this movie covers a lot of ground. They go to Sicily, obviously. So it's the scale of it is much bigger. And then I think some of the other characters that come in, like Hyman Roth, Patanjali, like all these, first of all, incredible performances by these actors, but they really kind of fill in the tapestry of this movie outside of the family. Because of course it's about the family, but it's also about how they're engaging. And even though Vito obviously had all this power, but they are the people in the pond as well
Hmm.
that are infiltrating and causing a lot of trouble. And how is this family reacting to that? I think it just sort of enriches the story that way. It also makes it more fun and pulpy, actually. Some
Oh,
of these
absolutely.
interactions
Yeah.
just kind of really fun to watch always. And even though those scenes are coming, like you said, you are sort of, you wait, with bated breath of like, oh,
Hmm.
how is this going to pan out? But yeah, with De Niro, sorry, I meant to say Pacino, he's amazing in this, in the quieter moments, like you mentioned. He's amazing, period.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do think in the first one, it's even a bigger masterclass in my mind because it's just so subtle and it's just so, it's all in his eyes. In this
Hmm.
one, part two, he does have his signature, yelly moments, which are, of course, all very effective. But there's something about the super restrained, all under the surface, simmering, bubbling kind of energy that he has in part one that I've actually never seen him do that since, which is kind of amazing. And it stands in its own kind of place, I guess.
No, I agree. It's like hard for me to like go back and forth between these two performances. I just think the scenes are more powerful, those
Right.
two, than what happens in the first movie for me, though. I think, you could easily, I mean, every time I watch Godfather, I'm like, no one's acted better in a movie other than Pacino. And then I watch
Yeah.
Godfather 2, I'm like, well, maybe he beat himself. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to watch the evolution in him as an actor. Because then when you see 3, which again, you should, that was made in like 90, there's a lot more of the classic sort of Al Pacino. I'll just use the word overacting, kind of yelly moments. He
Hoo
puts
ha.
that a lot. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. The hoo-ha Pacino is there, and it's sometimes I feel like, is this what Michael Corleone would turn into? I mean, maybe this is
Mm,
just an older version of Michael Corleone, or it's just Pacino's acting style changes. Maybe we'll do a Pacino episode at some point, and we can dive into this in more detail. But I like how you were pointing that out. He's gradually sort of getting the more hoo-ha Pacino. Even through these two movies, you can see it
right.
coming in a little bit more. But maybe it's the material. I don't know, or maybe it's just that him. Who knows?
Yeah. And then, of course, like the first one, the mise en scène, the cinematography, the music, how these intimate scenes and epic scenes are mounted. It's an experience, it's a journey, but it's also super intimate. You're part of the
Hmm.
family, but you also have a bird's eye view. It's just sort of hits on all these levels. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it's again, like you said, covering movies like this, it's hard to add anything else, but at the same time, you have to recognize that these are some of the most amazing movies, period, and that they
Yeah.
will go
And
down in history
timeless.
and absolutely timeless.
Keep delivering, keep beating their own hype, which
Yeah.
again, I'm just sort of in awe of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
every time I see them, I like them more. I see other
Yeah.
things in them, and I appreciate the
Yeah.
what was done, and it never gets diminished and only gets increased, which is
Yeah.
something it's rare. Few movies will do that, and these are definitely two of them.
Yeah.
So now that we've covered the masterpieces and the heights of what Coppola has done, let's go into the wild cards. This might get a little interesting here. What is your wild card choice for Francis Ford Coppola?
My wildcard is The Conversation from 1974, directed and written by Francis Ford Coppola, starring Gene Hackman, John Cazale, Alan Garfield, Terry Garr. I put this as a wild card only because how intimate this movie is. And he's done darker movies before. We talked about Apocalypse Now. It's like,
Right.
extreme example of the human side of darkness. I feel like there's something about this movie because it's so intimate. It's a much more contained story, mostly shot in rooms and streets of San Francisco and hotel rooms. And it's so focused on this one character in Gene Hackman that the darkness that comes through this movie just lands even further. And the darkness is not what humans can do, but there's a feeling of just abject despair, which is even a lower low
Hmm.
than what one feels when one watches something like Apocalypse Now. And I think it's because of that, because how contained and intimate this movie is kind of why I put it as a wild card. Although to be honest, I could almost put this as a masterpiece as well. I mean,
Yeah.
these four, like you mentioned, are all in that sort of pantheon. And this movie sort of feels almost like maybe even harder to make because it's just so intimate and so in the mind, and it's a gut punch of a movie, and you're on, once again, it's experiential because you
Hmm.
as an audience member are also trying to puzzle, just like Gene Hackman is listening through all these voice clues and sound cues the way he is trying to understand what is really going on, so you're very much part of it.
Hmm.
And then it does a number. It's probably one of the most memorable endings ever in a movie to me. So yeah, that's why I put this here. I'll pause and then share more thoughts. But you're the one who told me about this movie many years ago, and I watched it because you told me. So I know this is one of your favorites as well.
Yeah, I think this is a great film, and it's easy for this movie to get lost in
Right.
the shuffle of Godfather 1, Godfather 2, and Apocalypse Now, but I think it deserves to be in the discussion with those films. I don't think it's as good as those three, but few films are. But I do think it is, like you said, could be another masterwork of his. I think the subtle performance by Gene Hackman, I think it's the best thing
Uh,
he's ever done.
yeah.
It's all interior. It's this guy who cannot open up to anyone. So even as an audience, you can't really get inside his head. You don't really know kind of what's going on. And as he's then being racked with the guilt, I mean, his job is surveillance on people. And then he just like at one point in the film even says, "Oh, I don't know, I just recorded and delivered the tapes." And they're talking about, "Oh, afterwards someone got killed because of the information that, you." And he just, he's trying to keep this at an arm's length what he does, even though obviously the work that he does has really life and death consequences, especially even in this movie that he's trying to
Hmm.
piece together. And just watching him slowly drive himself insane, not only with paranoia, but this, I think, again, this feeling of guilt of like, what am I actually
Hmm.
doing? And what are the consequences of what I'm actually doing? They're real, even though I don't see them and I can kind of push them aside and ignore them. And I'm not directly involved. I'm not killing anyone directly. It's that easy sort of hands wash thing that sometimes people can do of like, look, I'm just delivering the information. Well, you're still kind of culpable in it. And I think I love those themes. And the other thing you mentioned too about the audience experiencing, I think that's where you can see Coppola's like innovation and testing something new because the sound design in this movie is insane.
Incredible.
You are following right along, like you said, with him as you're trying to decipher what's exactly being said. That
It's a
opening
procedural
sequence,
in
it's
that
a
sense.
procedural. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that opening sequence when you're just seeing
Yeah.
how they're spying on these two people and how they're collecting the information, what you're hearing along with them, it's just so cool and different and fresh. Even now it feels like that way, the way that they're able to use sound in this plot. So I think this movie is just like fantastic and is talked about a lot, but should always be
Yeah.
talked about even more in this run in the 70s that Coppola had.
Yeah. And I was thinking about if this movie were made now, it would be very self-aware and sort of, overly clever, would
Yep.
probably just be like a one-man show, just Gene Hackman doing this, and it'll be all first person point of view and what have you. Versus this movie, even though it's intimate and it's from his point of view, it feels fuller and richer. Like it feels cinematic of the
Hmm.
way it's shot, first of all. and how the sound design kind of interplays, but then also the way it's written. Like it's so important to see Gene Hackman's character's relationships with other people to get a true sense of what he's going through, like his
Right.
romantic relationships with his colleague in John Cazale, or the people he meets at the surveillance conference, his
Right. Right.
interactions with a very young and hot Harrison Ford. Uh, all of those matter, because the truth is we don't live, even someone like this who is sort of in their own armor isolated world in this paper thin jacket coat,
Yeah.
whatever that is.
I know. Weird
It's
look.
so cool, so amazing, like
Yeah.
says
Yeah.
so much about the character, right?
Hmm.
But even he's not alone, like he is interacting with other people. And in fact, each of those relationships are contributing to his slow paranoia and demise, and facing his own guilt
Hmm.
or his own faith and belief system, his relationship with God. Like, I think that scene where he goes for a confession is critical for him to voice how he really feels, even though he says that this doesn't matter and I'm just like the messenger, like you said. But that's where he starts to, like, it's been bubbling all along,
Right.
that he knows at some point place in his head and heart that this is not right, actually. And then he gets completely trapped in it. The music is amazing.
I
That
love the
theme
score.
is
Yeah, the jazz
so
piano score is so
so
great.
good. Yeah, this is a masterpiece. It's a shocker to me. I mean, it's not really, but it is, that he was not nominated for
Hmm.
best actor this year,
Yeah.
because maybe this is a time where this just feels so subtle that it doesn't even feel like acting. It's all just in his eyes. And it just reminded me, this is why Gene Hackman is in that pantheon of the best actors we've ever had.
Absolutely.
It's because of this, I think, and many other works, of course.
Right,
But
right, right. But this one too, just with his performance as well. I came to Gene Hackman, later in his career because the movies I was watching were like 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And he is known, similar like as Al Pacino, of having these big scenes where he yells and sort of
yeah.
gets like kind of big. It's like, Gene Hackman. And this movie, he's so not that. It's so
Mhm.
dialed back. And then you can see him really be able to pull off both the subtle acting when he's not talking or just the movements that he has. You can kind of understand what this character is going through. So it sort of strips back what I am more used to Gene Hackman's performances being a little bit bigger. And this being so small, the first time I saw this, I was like, this doesn't even feel like Gene Hackman to me when I first watched the movie.
No,
And the more and more times I see it, the more I just really think that this performance is the best he's ever given, and the sort
he
of
gets
quintessential
totally
Gene
lost.
Hackman.
And I think I'm not the one to say that the character should be likable. Like, as long as it's true and feels from within, I'm along for the ride. That's what I want to see. But there's something very sweet about his portrayal as well. Like, you
Yeah.
feel for this person. I think that adds another layer. Because if this person was, I don't know, Michael Fassbender's killer,
Oh,
it's a
right.
different movie,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Like, this person is sweet, and I don't even know how he got into this line of work. And there's something very sweet about that. I don't know.
I think that's what makes the movie when he's wrestling with his conscience a
Yeah.
little more interesting because you feel that he's not going at this because he's a nosy person or he wants to spy
Bring
on people.
harm.
He's more just like interested in the technology and that's kind of it. And again, I think that's why he's not realizing what he's actually doing. He's not. Whereas the other guy, the guy he meets at the conference, seems to a lot of people are like, oh, I like kind of like getting in there. And what are the
Right.
politicians saying? Or like, his motivation is a lot more just being a peeping tom or something, right?
Right.
Whereas Gene Hackman, that's not at all what it is. And I think once he starts realizing, yeah, even though that's not his motivation, the results are the same. That's where his crisis of faith and his crisis of guilt and conscience and all this stuff starts coming into it. And that's what makes the arc that his character goes on so interesting.
Exactly. And the despair at the end and his going
Oh
insane,
yeah.
like, lands so much harder because you sort of care for this person.
Uh-huh.
I think it's critical that he is this sweet, sort of nerdy, likable guy, who's trapped in this. And then I guess the other meta commentary on, as I was thinking about this movie this time, was, what do we really know about people and what they say?
Right.
Like, you don't actually. It's all up for interpretation, even if it's recorded. And it made me think, especially in today's world of, surveillance is like a whole other level with AI. Anything
Hmm.
can be generated. It doesn't matter. What is the truth? It's going to get even harder and harder. And ultimately, all we have left is just, I guess, humanity
Right.
and emotion, although even that can be faked and doctored up. We've been doing that since the beginning of times and now more so. So I don't know, it made me think about that at a meta level, just
Yeah.
watching this movie this time, is that what is the truth and what do we believe and what should we not believe?
Right. It's like the difference between listening and understanding. Like
Right,
he listens to these conversations and the key moment of like, he'd kill us if he had the chance. Like you listen to that, but you don't understand exactly what's going on there, and that is what obviously propels the plot forward. But you're right, it's a lot. Communication is the theme of this movie, and just
right,
because you hear someone or read what someone says or see like a tweet of whatever that someone said, you're not really understanding what they're doing. You have to get into a dialogue. There has to be that
right.
that two-way back and forth. You can't just listen. You're not really going to understand,
No,
and that's why communication is important. And I think that's one of
totally.
the themes of this movie too.
Totally. And you bring your own baggage, right? Like this couple
Exactly.
feels innocent and sweet, and she feels scared and what have you. And you're bringing all that baggage that, oh, of course they are in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Guess what? Something
Mm-hmm.
else is going on. You have
Right.
no clue.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because you're bringing, like you said, you're bringing your own baggage and you're filling in gaps instead of
Right.
asking questions and getting more information.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to be said of the message of the movie in that meta sense. I think you're right, is all about communication and
And
understanding and not
dialogue.
just, and dialogue, right? And not just, oh, I heard something, so I'm going to fill in all the gaps and assume I knew what
Right.
was going on, because that's usually you're wrong when you do
Usually
that.
you're wrong, which is why, and whenever I read, like, especially in the clickbait culture,
Oh,
it's like,
right.
who knows? Everybody's in it, in
Ex
the
ex
same pool, you
exactly.
know. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So what's your wild card?
So my wild card is Coppola's movie he made right after Apocalypse Now called One from the Heart from 1981. The plot summary: a couple has a fight after living together for 5 years in Las Vegas. They go out and celebrate the 4th of July, each with a new partner. Breakup? Question mark. That's weird. That's a weird summary. They could have phrased that a little bit. It almost sounds like a mistranslation of something else, but that's what's on IMDb. This is co-written and directed by Coppola, starring Frederick Forrest, Terry Garr, and Raul Julia. So this is a movie that I'd always heard of, just in passing, of like, oh, terrible flop, horrible film. It did actually bankrupt Coppola. Like I'll get into this in a bit in terms of all the chips he put on the table for this movie. But it was very hard to find. It was not a movie that was streaming anywhere. You couldn't rent it anywhere. It was also a movie that was not on DVD, I don't believe, in the United States. You had to get like foreign imports. So it was hard to find. So I never really bothered to track it down until last year when I did my full rewatch of all of his 20 plus movies. I was able to find a copy of it online. And I was just kind of, I don't want to say blown away by this, but I really liked the movie when I first saw it during that rewatch. And actually, subsequently, it's been restored in 4K. It's now played in theaters, and a new cut that Coppola had called One from the Heart Reprise that played in theaters. Actually saw in theaters this year. I've actually seen this movie 3 times this year already, not including the podcast. So I keep going back to it
Ah,
because there's something about it, and every time I see it, I like it even more and more. And I just have to say that something about the simplicity of the story. It's just the typical, like the plot summary said. A couple who sort of kind of in the dumps with their romance, and they go try other people, and then they realize that they were meant for each other and what real love is. And even though there might be problems with the person you're with, you still want to kind of sort through them. It's a simple story that has been told a dozen times in various media, but the way that it's told, the dreamlike structure of the film, the fact that it was shot entirely on a soundstage where they recreated like streets in Las Vegas in a studio just because Coppola wanted control over everything instead of shooting on location, just gives this a very, I don't know, interesting quality that feels like kind of a 1930s musical, but also feels not realistic, but realistic. And I don't know, there's something about the vibe, I guess is the right way to put it, about this movie that just, I don't know, feels magical and unique. And I just, every time I see it, I like it more. So this is a wild card for him because of what he tried to do, and it failed, and it bankrupted him, and it took him 10 years to kind of climb out of this the financial hole this put him in. But also because I think this is a hidden gem, and something that should be studied and talked about in terms of Coppola's major works. I think this is right up there with the movies we talked about, and Dracula as some of his best works. So I'll pause there. I have a lot more to say about the film, but what was your, I'm assuming you hadn't seen this before. I mean, it's again really hard to track this down.
yeah. First time seeing it. I think I saw it on the Criterion or somewhere. And I agree with you that pleasantly surprised by the dreamlike quality of it. It feels very theatrical,
Yes,
and it's
absolutely.
interesting to watch Megalopolis after this is the last Coppola movie I saw, and then I saw
Ah, before
Megalopolis.
Megalopolis. Ah, interesting.
And I think they share that same kind of theatrical, all control, singular vision with one person behind it. I think there's a lot to admire about it, but less to love about it. I think like you do get lost in the construction of it and the theatrical element of it, but I could also just never get past the artificiality of it,
Mm,
whether it's, and I don't even mean the actual sets and the control nature. Actually, that's actually quite beautiful and striking. More about just the story and the conceit and the performances, because it's very heightened.
hmm.
And for you, at least for me, to kind of be along for the ride, to care enough about this romance and these people, I don't know, want a little bit more realism. And it's just too dreamlike or
Yes.
fantastical right from the get-go, even from the first fight, and the way sort of they are filmed and the way they luxuriate with each other, but also when they're alone. It's the more cynical read of this would be, an auteur director sort of just, having it all.
Hmm.
And, why are people walking around topless and luxuriating and taking their clothes off and all of that? I guess a slightly more kinder perception or response to that could be that, yeah, he's just creating this kind of mood piece, which is theatrical and such. So yeah, not as high on it as you are. I am intrigued though to watch it again to maybe appreciate that. But yeah, this is my favorite kind of movie, right? Like human story about relationships, but I think there's something about the artificiality and the conceit of at least the way the actors are portrayed that just kept me at a distance. The rest of it, though, the how the city looks and how the characters vibe with the rest of the place, like that was actually very interesting and engaging, and I kind of wanted to be there. And so as an experiment, once again, putting a theatrical play on film, I think it's successful. And once again, I give him props for like innovation, like I don't think I've seen many movies like this. Although I'm curious to hear if you thought about this. I kept thinking of one of the movies I brought to the podcast maybe last year, Umbrellas of Cherbourg,
Mm.
which is very heightened. Everything is said in a musical way. It is a love story, and there's something about that movie that I don't know worked on me much much better. Even though it's theatrical and musically and heightened, you kind of get lost in those performances and those people, and there's a lot of heartache that you feel for Catherine Deneuve and what she's going through versus these people. They just felt very hollow to me, because this is again goes back to the director, nothing to do with Terry Gar and the guy. She's great. It's more of him. I think he's too much in the way of what he's trying to do, as again, basically.
Yeah, like a lot of what you're saying is how I felt the first time I saw it last year.
Mm.
And I think, again, a difference that we've noticed between the two of us in this podcast, I'm sure our listeners would agree with this too, is, I definitely tend to gravitate more towards the sort of over the top, kind of showy, theatrical type of storytelling than you do. So I'm sort of, I think, a little easier for me to swallow that pill, even though I definitely, when I first saw it too, I also didn't connect as much with the characters as I did just the approach to the filmmaking is what intrigued me, and that's what kept
Mm.
bringing me back to this of like I just something about the way that this feels. I want to keep seeing this and feeling the things that the cameras and the lighting and the staging makes me feel. And then after watching it for now, I've seen it 4 times in the last 12 months. Now I start feeling for the characters. And maybe this is
Mm.
just because I've seen it so many times, or I mean, which I'm not saying this is a good thing about the movie. I think the fault is that between I think the performances and I don't really buy at least when I first saw it, really buy their relationship, and I don't really want to root for it. And then like, what's the point then if you don't want to root for the relationship that
It's
is
too
trying to be saved?
artificial.
Right, right. Now all that stuff works on me because I've just seen it, I think, enough times that I do kind of gravitate towards these characters. But I definitely agree the theatrics of this, and I think this is why it was so panned and a gigantic financial disaster at the time, was because of that. It was just too much of all the style and no substance. And I just love style, so I'm willing to forgive less substance with style. And then as I kind of keep coming back to this because of the style, then I start finding more in the substance. And just because I'm sure very few people have seen this, when we mean style, again, the whole thing is shot on a soundstage, made it look like though it's Las Vegas, like they've recreated the streets and these houses. There are shots in this movie where scene transitions happen in camera. So Terry Garr will be talking to her friend in an apartment building, talking about how she's breaking up and it's so horrible. And then there'll be a silk screen of a wall that you can't notice because of the lighting, and then that the lighting changes, and all of a sudden the wall dissolves, and it's now Frederick Forrest and his friend's apartment complaining about
Right.
their relationship, and all this stuff is in camera effects and just is stunning and something that he had this very clear vision of doing. Actually, one of the things he wanted to do originally was shoot the movie live, and they was using for the very first time like video recording and editing technology that he wanted to record 10-minute. They can only record 10-minute segments at a time, and he was going to record the entire movie live, like a stage play in 10-minute chunks. And it actually was his cinematographer, Vito Storaro, again, who worked on Apocalypse Now, was like, look, we can't do that because I need time between the lighting setups. You can't
Mm.
just I can't do this. And actually, I was listening to an interview with Coppola recently about Megalopolis, and he's like, doing a lot of looking back on his life. And he says, I only have two regrets in my life. And one of them is not firing Storaro when he told me that. He was too good of a friend. He felt like family. I couldn't fire him, even though I wanted to find another cinematographer who could have actually done what I wanted, which
Mm.
is 10 minute, 10 minute, 10 minute without some change in the lighting setups, which I thought was just interesting. Because actually, what I love about the movie is what Storaro is able to do. I mean, I think this is some of his best work with the colors that are
It
involved in
looks
this thing. It's just
amazing. Yeah.
absolutely style over the top.
I didn't know about that, but I think if it were shot that way, because one thing that's very true about theatrical productions is that they're very live, they're
Hmm.
alive. You can feel that texture. And I think if the movie was shot in that way, I think it would land very differently. I think it'll be, yeah, just more alive versus I found myself kind of checking out and getting a little bit bored, especially when they were in rooms just like talking because of the artificiality thing. But
Right,
yeah,
right.
maybe if it were shot in that way, maybe it would feel just lighter on its feet and you wouldn't care so much about who these people are, backstories, whatever. You would just be watching a play
Yeah.
essentially, but done with a lot of style and on
Right, right.
screen.
Yeah, I think to your point too, the sequence that really comes alive in that way to me is the big dance sequence with Raul
Right.
Julia and Terry Garr in the main Las Vegas Boulevard that
Yeah.
does feel like you're watching a play, and it is that
Right.
energy that is not there throughout the rest of the film at all. And yeah, maybe it would have been different though. Again, I just when he said that, I was like, you wanted to fire like one of the best cinematographers that has ever existed. And I think that to me that the strength of this film is actually his cinematography
Right.
is what intrigued me about this movie and makes me keep coming back to it. But just again to fill in a little bit of history on the film too, and why this is really a wild card for him. I mean, he was this is we mentioned American Zoetrope was this artist commune that he tried to start in the '60s and kind of failed. This was the second attempt at that after having success with the Godfather movies and Apocalypse Now. He had a ton of money and he invested all of his own personal money into building a studio or buying a studio in Santa Monica where he was going to film all of these movies in the same style of live to tape. Essentially, he invented this technology or worked on inventing this technology that allowed for live editing to happen
Mm.
using videotapes. You could edit as the scene was being recorded, and he invested all of his money in this because he thought this is the future. And the movie was a giant flop and it bankrupted him. And this is again the price of innovation. You're going to lose more times than
Or
you win.
ego.
And ego too, exactly. You think, yeah, you have to have an ego if you're an entrepreneur and
Right.
someone willing to take these risks. Definitely ego, and it did. I mean, for 10 years, it completely bankrupted him, and he was not until Godfather 3 and then the huge success of Dracula, did he have any kind of money again. And he was saying too, like he lost a lot of his creative juice, I think, after this movie too. When you watch the rest of the films he made, really up until I think Dracula is when he felt more like taking risks and more alive again. I think this took a lot out of him, the failure of this, which I don't
I
know if in a
bet.
way he never recovered from. I mean, coming off of the movies we just talked about, the two Godfathers, Conversation, Apocalypse Now, then to have this movie which does not deserve to be held in the conversation with those for sure. I'm not saying
Yeah.
it's that good at all, but have that much financial and critical success and then be met with financial failure, bankrupting yourself personally because you put your own money into it, and critics being like, this guy is ridiculous, and the movie being completely panned must have been really hard on the guy. And that is what I was thinking about when I first kind of saw the movie, is that piece of it. And now since I've seen it so many times, I kind of divorce myself from the what was going on in Coppola's life. Though I do think it adds a lot of interesting layers to what this film was and what it means to him just as an artist.
Yeah, you can feel the effort, and to the movie's success or not,
Hmm.
because that's maybe another reason why it doesn't all come together. Because for a thing like this, it has to feel light and effortless, kind of how good theatrical productions are, but you
Yeah.
feel the effort of somebody mounting all of this, literally creating all this and putting a lot on the line. And you feel that. And you don't want to feel that when you're watching any work of art, in my
Right.
opinion,
Hmm. Right,
The
right,
other
right.
thing also that was, you tell me since you watched all of his movies, I haven't seen him deal with romance and love as like the primary subject of a movie. His movies have been more about family or internal struggles or the dark side of humanity, usually the dark side of man.
Hmm.
And I think this is a little bit of uncharted territory. I wish he had applied some of his new technology, whatever he's doing, for like a different story, in set in Vegas, in constructed city, whatever. But like something else, like I don't associate Coppola with heartbreak and heartache and the struggles between man and woman. Like this at heart is like a Woody Allen movie,
Hmm.
actually, but in the hands of a different director. I would argue the wrong director in this case. So I think there's a little bit of that too, but a good wild card in that sense, right? I don't see any of that in his filmography. Like even in Megalopolis, like you were saying, it's the love that doesn't
Doesn't work.
really come through. That's true in most of his movies, actually. And he's famously not really made that many great sort of female characters in his movies.
Right. Yeah, I think the only
Yeah.
other movie that's really about love in the same kind of way is Dracula. But
Yeah.
beyond that, you're right. Like he's never really touched on this. And I think, as he said, coming out of Apocalypse Now, which is
Maybe he wanted
he
that.
wanted something. Yeah, the original conceit of this movie was a very small, low budget love story, which then ballooned into, I mean, the budget was supposed to be, I think, $5 million dollars, and ended up being 35 just because of all these things. Oh, I can apply all this technology. And again, I think the ego, like you said,
Yeah.
coming after Apocalypse Now, where the whole thing was a disaster and then it was a giant success. He's
Yeah.
like, then he can kind of walk into something that feels like a disaster, thinking, oh, it'll be fine on the other side. This will work because my last one, worked, even though my actor was having a heart attack and we're stuck in the jungle for 3 years. Like, I can do this again. And I mean, again, I think artistically he did pull off something that is very special and unique and groundbreaking in many ways. But, obviously it's not at all close to the level of the films we just talked about. So the gamble doesn't pay off, but I think that's what makes him so exciting as a filmmaker to me, is he'll take those gambles. He easily could have done Godfather 3 at that point, or just rested on his laurels and, just got into other businesses like his wine and hotel businesses. Like, he could have just coasted on Apocalypse Now, but instead he just bet the farm. And sometimes you lose the farm when you bet the farm. But
Yeah.
I think that's cool. That's what makes him, in my mind, like more of a real artist, because he's putting the art first than a lot of other of these filmmakers in Hollywood that try to be a little more safe or are in it for the money. I mean, at this point, he clearly wasn't, which is, you could say dumb. Like, why would you ever put your own money into your own film? I mean, hell, even at the Megalopolis, he invested even more money than in this one. He bet the farm again at this point, right? He sold most of his wineries and his hotels, and $100 million of his own money put into this. But I don't know. I kind of respect that in the same way we talked about in the Kevin Costner episode, how he's doing the same thing with his Horizon movies. Obviously, not to the same extent of his own financial investment as Coppola's doing, but I don't know. There's something about that I think is cool. Even if the movie doesn't work, respect is what I have to give to these
Yeah.
artists that are putting it on the line. But
I
I,
respect that too, except that I think it's the ego part that bothers me because so
hmm.
much of this is driven by that. And yeah, there is a veneer, or I shouldn't say veneer, but there's like a layer, genuine, of art
Hmm.
and maybe even innovation pushing the medium. But I think the bulk of the cake sitting underneath that frosting is of ego.
Yeah,
And
true. Yeah.
that's what bothers me, and that's why the product is not good, because if it's coming from that place, so I've done this before, I know how this goes, I know what the world is going to look like or what the best city is going to be, so let me sort of layer it all out on you. if only there was just a little bit more of hubris or humility or subtlety in these works, they would actually go much further for the sake of art and also for him. But these are two sides of the same coin, right? Like maybe
Exactly.
you need that to kind of push yourself, and maybe the one can't exist without the other. I think it can, but clearly not in this case. And
Yeah.
that's why he's fascinating, always will be. And I say this, what am I? This is somebody who made the four greatest movies
Right.
ever, and the two especially. So, how do you come off of that? How do you keep making movies, and what do you put on the line? What does your brain tell you?
Hmm.
We would never know, because there are a handful of people who've tasted that level of greatness and that level of turmoil while creating that level of greatness. So of course it's going to alter you forever, on the choices
Absolutely.
you make and what you put on the line and how much ego you have. So maybe it's all earned. Maybe we are all lucky for it to kind of see this happen in front of our eyes.
That's true. And in a way, another respect that'll give to him is that he kept going.
Yeah.
I mean, other people after One from the Heart, or even like him trying to come back in the 80s and had many financial failures after that too, could have just kind of drifted out of Hollywood and done something else. But he is persisted because he is putting like the artist inside of him cannot help but put art
Right.
into the world, even if after the Rainmaker he kind of goes off and makes these like again, some of the worst movies I've ever seen were the ones he made like in the last 20 years, like just unmitigated disasters, but he had to put art there in the world, which I credit him for that. Unlike, I mean, look, I love George Lucas to death, and he's one of the most important people that inspired me, but he kept claiming, oh, after I sell Star Wars, I just want to go back to making independent movies for myself again. He's done none of that. Whereas Coppola has done that, and he's still doing that,
Mhm.
even if there's shit. He doesn't care. He's putting it out there. So that I just have to respect. He's not
Yeah.
resting on his laurels. Speaking of resting, what do you think he should do next? Rest, keep going? What do you want to see from Coppola? More wine? A new vintage?
I think he should rest. This is a amazing legacy, and we are mixed on Megalopolis, but I
Hmm.
think if this is the last movie he makes, it's actually a pretty good one to go out on, I think. It has a signature tropes or themes. It's true to him, like putting all of his money, ego, everything on the line, and it's engaging and watchable and interesting, So and plus he's very old, and I don't want him to go through another cycle of putting it all on the line and then falling down and coming all the way back up. No,
Yeah.
enjoy the life you have. And yeah, so that's my wish.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would like to say the same in terms of this is sort of the perfect capstone on his career. Not that the movie's perfect at all, but I think
No.
this is a great ending for him. It's just he's such a like the more I've read about him in my exploration last year and interviews and things, he just seems like a genuinely great guy and a true artist in the sense of if he wasn't making movies, I don't think he would like live much longer, especially after his wife just recently passed away. And he's talked a lot about in the press tour of Megalopolis. He's like, yeah, like I'm probably dying soon. Like I know this is the end and doing all this sort of like introspection and look back because he knows like maybe he only has months, weeks, days. He doesn't know, but he's sort of okay with his own mortality at this point. It
Mm.
makes me kind of feel that yeah, if he stopped making movies, that might be there might be no reason for him to continue to want to be on this earth. And just he seems like a cool guy. I want him to still be alive. So I'm like, I hope he does something else, but I don't, I think Megalopolis will be his final kind of major work, especially if he goes back to making movies like he has over the last 20 years, like between Megalopolis and The Rainmaker. Like those movies should not be talked about or studied very much other than just being an interesting experimentation period in his career. I'm fine with him going back to that as long as it keeps him around. I think he's a good, one of the true old masters still alive, just a wealth of cinema knowledge like a Scorsese. I loved hearing him just talk about film and talk about
Yeah.
art, and I think he's just such an important voice, and also in that new Hollywood movement that he came out of from the 60s, 70s. We didn't talk much about that, but he was part of that crew that really did change cinema and American movie making forever. And I just like having those people around to hear from. But in
Yeah,
terms of,
maybe that's what he should
you
do
know,
more of, like talk about
yeah,
this,
yeah, yeah,
and I
yeah.
think the way Scorsese has become like an elder statesman, I don't think of Coppola in that sense because he's not been out, maybe because he's been busy making this or
Hmm.
whatever, but I think
Hmm.
he should maybe spend his time just sharing his knowledge, wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And I like his wine. I think his wine's not bad. I would recommend listeners check that out too. Well, cool. This is a really fun exploration and a big episode. I think this might be one of our longest ones, but I think Coppola deserves it. Maybe later we'll do a director's cut of this. I'll go back and edit this in 5 years and
Oh
do
my
a
gosh.
extended version of our Coppola episode. We should tell listeners we had a whole musical segment, but unfortunately I had to cut it for time. But maybe in a couple years I'll reinsert it back in and then we can release that episode. It was fun. I think our harmonies, our voices did very well together. So speaking of musicals, I guess, why don't
Oh
you tell our
wow.
listeners about the next episode and movie we are covering?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the new Joker movie, Joker Folie à Deux, and talking about Joaquin Phoenix and sharing our thoughts on him and through his, top movies. So excited
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, me too. I cannot made to Joaquin the Line.
Oh my
Did that
gosh.
work? Did that work? Did that joke work? I
It's
don't know.
pretty good. It's pretty good.
Well, we hope you enjoyed the discussion today. Be sure to let us know in the comments your thoughts on Coppola. What are some of your favorite movies of his that we maybe didn't touch on? We are available here on YouTube as well as all podcast platforms, so don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Also, please rate and review us and like this video as that really helps new listeners find the show. And with that, Karan, goodbye.
See ya.
Then, Karan, remember, leave the gun. Take the cannoli.